Okay. I love it. Good afternoon. I'm Congresswoman Terri Sewell, and I proudly represent Alabama's 7th Congressional District, which includes the historic cities of Birmingham, Montgomery, my hometown of Selma, Alabama. I am also proud to serve as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Elections for the House Administration Committee. Today, on National Voter Registration Day, it is with great pride and great purpose that I stand with my Democratic colleagues to reintroduce the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act into the House of Representatives. Generations of Americans, many in my hometown of Selma, marched, fought, bled, and some even died for the equal right of all Americans to vote. It was their sacrifice that brought us the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But today, we know that old battles have become new again. Indeed, their legacy and our very democracy is under attack. Across the nation, extremists are working to restrict voter access, undermine faith in our election system, and dilute the power of the Black vote and minority voters. We are now 10 years removed from the disastrous Shelby County versus Holder decision, when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. And in those 10 years, we've witnessed relentless attacks on voter access, closing polling stations without notification, bans on early voting and vote by mail, strict ID requirements, purging of voter rolls, and the list goes on and on. Just this past year, we've seen state legislatures introduce at least 322 bills to restrict voter access in 45 states. Throughout the past decade, one thing is clear. The fight for voting rights is as urgent today as it was a decade ago. Named for our late and amazingly great colleague, civil rights hero, John Lewis, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would restore and modernize the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. It will protect the rights to vote, strengthen our democracy, and ensure that every American has access to the ballot box. The right to vote should never be partisan, but sadly, we know that is no longer the case. So I asked my colleagues, what's changed? After all, the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized 5 times with large bipartisan majorities, most recently in 2006, when it passed 98-0 in the Senate and was signed by Republican President George W. Bush. There is no reason that the effort to restore full strength of the Voting Rights Act should be any different. The refusal of my Republican colleagues to come to the table is a testament of the extremism that infiltrates their party. I want to thank the members who have joined me today, all of whom have been great partners in this fight. Their presence sends a clear message. Democracy and Democrats are united to protect our democracy and safeguard our sacred right to vote. You know, it was our friend, our late colleague, John Lewis, who, stricken with cancer the last time he was on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, still stood up. And he said, his last words were, "We should never give up, never give in, keep the faith, and keep our eyes on the prize." So we Democrats, House Democrats, are ready to get into some good trouble as we reintroduce the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. It gives me great pleasure to announce the next speaker from the Republic of Brooklyn. Did I say it right? None other than our House Leader, Hakeem Jeffries.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Terri, for your incredible leadership. We know Terri is substantive and smart and strong and strategic. Of course, a Southern Belle from Selma, and we appreciate all that she's done in a wide variety of areas, but particularly in this area of advancing the incredibly important cause of voting rights in America. Voting rights shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. It's an American issue. The right to vote is sacred. It's central to the integrity of our democracy, to the principle of free and fair elections, and of course to the principle of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It begins and ends with the right to vote and ensuring that the people are able to determine those individuals, such as members of Congress and the president and governors and state legislators, who have the privilege of serving in office on behalf of the people. The system does not work unless there is an unfettered right to vote. That is why the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is so central, because we have to repair the damage that was done by an out of control Supreme Court in 2013 with the Shelby versus Holder decision. This right-wing extremist Supreme Court in 2013 unleashed an epidemic of voter suppression in the United States of America. And the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is designed to address that epidemic and end it so that we can open up free and fair elections for every single American in every single zip code in this country. We have an incredible array of leaders within the Congress on the House Democratic Caucus side who represent every single asset, every single facet, every single component within the House Democratic Caucus family, because this issue unites us. It should unite the Congress. This should not be a partisan issue. As Terri Sewell mentioned, the Voting Rights Act traditionally has been very bipartisan up until recent events and certainly the Supreme Court's decision in 2013. It was, of course, signed into law by President Johnson, a Democratic president, with big bipartisan majorities in the House and in the Senate. But it was reauthorized in 1970 by Richard Nixon, a Republican president, reauthorized again in 1975 by Gerald Ford, a Republican president, reauthorized again in 1982 by Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, reauthorized again in 2006 by George W. Bush, a Republican president. This is not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. It's an American issue, and we are urging the Republicans in this Congress to shake the poisonous partisanship that has brought you to this point of trying to undermine the right to vote and stand on the shoulders of your 4 Republican presidents who were there trying to lift up the right to vote in the past. We're going to continue to show up and stand up and speak up until we end the era of voter suppression in this country and the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is over the finish line. It's now my honor to yield to our great House Majority Whip from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Katherine Clark.
I like the ring of that. Thank you to Leader Jeffries and to all my colleagues who stand here and represent our entire Democratic caucus. And a special thanks to Congresswoman Terri Sewell for leading the charge to preserve, to protect, and defend our nation's greatest treasure, free and fair elections. And thank you to all my colleagues who are here to honor the legacy of our friend, this bill's legendary namesake, Congressman John Lewis. Congressman Lewis believed there is nothing more precious, no tool more powerful than a freely cast ballot. But nearly 6 decades after he marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, extremists are still trying to take away that sacred right to vote. Those anti-democratic forces believe their ideas are the only ones that matter. They only want to advance their ideology, strengthen their power at the expense of everyone else's. That's why they started the big lie. That's why they waged an insurrection on our Capitol. That's why they've introduced hundreds of voter suppression bills since January 6th, because they believe the voting booth should only admit those who look and think like them. If we want to preserve government by the people, if we want to defend all that Congressman Lewis fought for, we need to take action now. Our right to vote wasn't handed to us. It wasn't freely granted. It was fought for in Birmingham and Atlanta, in Selma and Seneca Falls. As Congressman Lewis put it, democracy is not a state, it is an act, and each generation must do its part. Now it's time to do our part and get this bill to President Biden's desk. And our great partner in fighting for equality and justice and the right to vote is our caucus chair, Pete Aguilar.
Thank you so much, Whip Clark. I remember Whip Clark working with John Lewis on the House floor when Leader Jeffries talks about showing up, standing up, and speaking up. So thank you for your leadership. And thank you, Terri Sewell, for yours. The right to vote is sacred because our fellow Americans have given their lives for it. John Lewis knew this, and he fought every day he was here in Congress for this right. And so it's in his memory that we carry this legacy forward. Because despite the progress that we've made as a nation, we continue to witness assaults on our very democracy. We're living in a world where young people are growing up with fewer rights than their parents and their grandparents. And that's true with respect to voting rights and so many of our freedoms. MAGA extremists want to go backwards against the progress that we've made, shutting out millions from democracy. The American dream will never be realized until our ballot box is in reach for every American. We will keep pushing for laws like the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to strengthen the bedrock of our democracy and to protect the right to vote for every American. It will take all of us to carry on the legacy of John Lewis as someone who has a long shadow, a legacy of helping our country, helping our caucus, and helping the great people in South Carolina is our leader, Jim Clyburn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. John Lewis and I first met as college students, 19-year-old college students, back in 1960. And several years ago, in the Shelby v. Holder case, when the Supreme Court handed down that decision, John and I talked a lot about the efforts that we had undertaken as college students and what that decision meant. We started talking about the throwback to those years when people in the South, most especially, were subjected to such indignities like counting or determining how many beans, jelly beans, were in a jar in order to qualify to vote. Asked to interpret the Constitution for people who could not even read the Constitution. But then, in the run-up to the last presidential election, I started hearing things, started seeing things that reminded me not so much of what we did out on the streets in the 1960s, but it reminded me of the things I was studying in the classrooms. And one thing particularly came to mind. And I went back and I did the research to find it. And I found it in this document. And it was a memorandum written by a man named Martin Witherspoon Gary, a Confederate general from Edgefield, South Carolina, who wrote a memorandum instructing Wade Hampton and others on how to go about nullifying the impact of the newly and formerly enslaved African Americans who in the South were showing up in great numbers and holding office, and they decided in the 1876 presidential election to nullify those votes. And all that I was hearing during that campaign and what I heard during that dreadful day that the insurrection took place in this building is all in this document. This is nothing new. I'm convinced that those on the other side either studied it or were taught it, and they did after the elections exactly what's in this document. So this is not an issue that ought to just unify the members of this Congress. This should unify the people of this country, because unless we are looking forward to reliving those days of Jim Crow that followed the slaughterhouse cases of 1872, just like Shelby v. Holder, we are in for some tough times unless we can reauthorize this John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which will protect the franchise for people who are really believers in this democracy, people who have given their all to make sure that everybody has a free, unfettered right to vote. And we are not going to do that unless we can rally the American people to do the things that are necessary to maintain this democracy and our greatness as a country. And with that, I'm pleased to present Mr. Morelle.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Clyburn, for your lifetime of leadership, your eloquence, and your passion on this. And I want to thank my colleague and friend, Terri Sewell, for her years of leadership on this critical bill and in the fight for the right to vote. And thank you to everyone who's on the stage today. This is a remarkable gathering. I'm so grateful to be with all my colleagues, particularly grateful to Leader Jeffries for providing me with the opportunity to help lead the fight for the protection and strengthening of our democracy as the ranking member of the Committee on House Administration. We're all here because we recognize the incredible, magnificent power embedded in our freedom to vote. We're also aware of the magnitude of the threat to the system of government and the harm done to families across this country when people's voices aren't heard. We're reminded of this back in my hometown of Rochester, New York. I never grow tired of explaining to folks Rochester was home to two of America's most passionate, iconic, and well-known advocates for voting rights, Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony. We take very seriously in my community the ties to that sacred history. We also have a poignant connection to John Lewis. On Bloody Sunday in 1965, when John Lewis was bloodied and beaten, it was the nuns of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Rochester, New York, who gave him first aid. And he often credited them with saving his life. The first time I had the privilege of meeting Congressman Lewis, I was a state legislator, and he came up to Rochester and met with my predecessor and dear friend Louise Slaughter, who hosted Congressman Lewis for a visit to Rochester, and he insisted on visiting and being reunited with the nuns in the Mother House at Sisters of St. Joseph. And today a mural of John Lewis resides in downtown Rochester, not far from my office, but also not far from a statue of Frederick Douglass and from where he wrote the North Star newspaper. And in that, Douglass wrote, "The liberties of the American people are dependent upon the ballot box." And after being arrested in 1872 for having the temerity to cast a ballot for president, Susan B. Anthony said, "Our democratic Republican government is based on the idea of the natural right of each individual member to a voice and a vote in making and executing the laws." some of the most effective protections of those natural rights and those liberties have been taken away. The threats to our democracy are intensifying, from restrictions on voting to dark money to extremism to misinformation to election deniers. We are here today because those attacks must not go unanswered. Democracy must prevail. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, together with the Freedom to Vote Act, which we introduced earlier this year, will restore the Voting Rights Act, strengthen our democracy, and ensure every single eligible voter in this country's voice is heard. We will fight for these bills because we believe in our core that democracy works best when and only when everyone's voice is heard and everyone participates. As Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony once did, it is now our turn to ensure every American has an equal say in the decisions governing our lives. We will honor their legacy and the legacy of Congressman John Lewis. We will pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We will pass the Freedom to Vote Act, and we will continue moving forward in the fight for free, fair, and equal access to the ballot for all Americans. Thank you, and I now want to call up the dean of my delegation from New York, a longtime friend and colleague, Jerry Nadler.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Terri Sewell for her longstanding leadership on this essential legislation. Voting rights are under renewed and sustained assault across the country, and we must pass this bill now to restore the promise of the Voting Rights Act. After a series of troubling Supreme Court rulings, which have enabled voter suppression efforts by states and localities, the need for a revitalized Voting Rights Act has never been greater. It has been a decade since the disastrous decision in Shelby County versus Holder, which gutted Section 5 of the Act, and Democrats have been fighting ever since to restore and strengthen this foundational civil rights law. But we have not, and we will not stop fighting until we succeed. It took almost 100 years after adoption of the 14th and 15th Amendments before Congress finally fulfilled the promise of those amendments by passing the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It took a sustained campaign by our beloved late colleague, John Lewis, Dr. King, and other champions of the civil rights movement before Congress did its constitutional duty. We cannot let their work go in vain. The Voting Rights Act was designed to enforce the Constitution's guarantee that all Americans be allowed to vote in fair elections, free from racial discrimination by the state. While in many ways the Act achieved its aims, the threat to voting rights and American democracy remains and has continued to evolve. For example, within hours of the Shelby County decision, various states moved to adopt draconian voter ID laws, which had already been declared unconstitutional before Shelby County. Others co-opted the redistricting process following the 2020 census as part of their ongoing attack on voting rights. Just look at Alabama, which has continued to this day to brazenly resist drawing a congressional district map that provides Black voters a fair opportunity to elect candidates of their choice, in open defiance of a Supreme Court decision finding that its initial map had a racially discriminatory impact. An elected government that does not accurately reflect the participation of all American voters regardless of race is no true democracy. Our Constitution demands that we do better. As ranking member of the Judiciary Committee's Constitution Subcommittee at the time, I helped lead bipartisan efforts in 2006 to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, and it passed the House overwhelmingly by a vote of 390 to 333. The Senate followed suit, passing it 98-0, and President George Bush signed it into law. Sadly, that seems like ancient history now. But updating and strengthening the Voting Rights Act to address the current challenges is a moral imperative, and there is no time to waste. I hope Congress will honor the sacrifices of those who marched, struggled, and even died to secure the right to vote, and will rediscover the bipartisan spirit that once animated our work to protect the rights of all Americans to vote. I thank Terri Sewell and the other sponsors of this legislation and our distinguished leadership, and I urge swift passage of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce a fighter for civil rights and civil liberties, Steve Horsford.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the ranking member, to Leader Jeffries, to our distinguished leadership. I'm Representative Stephen Horsford, representing Nevada's 4th Congressional District, and I currently serve as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. First, let me thank my esteemed colleague and dear friend, Representative Terri Sewell, for your tremendous leadership, your resolve, and your perseverance for continuing this important work on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus and the namesake of this legislation, Representative John Lewis. Voting rights is and always has been the CBC's North Star. The late Congressman John Lewis said, "The vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful, nonviolent tool we have in a democracy." Sadly, right now, that tool is under threat. It is fitting that on today, National Voter Registration Day, we reintroduce the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to protect the tool and to restore and modernize the protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As we speak, extremists at the local, state, and local levels are running the table with every tactic in their arsenal to keep people, particularly Black people, from the ballot box. To date, more than 322 bills to restrict voter access has been introduced in 45 states around the country with the aim of closing polling locations, curbing early voting and voting by mail, and imposing stricter voter ID requirements. To be clear, these efforts are coordinated, they are well-funded, and they are targeting our communities. It was about a decade ago, I was here as a freshman member that year, 2013, when the Supreme Court struck down key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And it was here where we talked about and reintroduced the Voting Rights Act then. 10 years later, the first time in 40 years, over 40 years now, Republicans have not worked with Democrats to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, as Leader Jeffries has said. The question is why? Why now? What is stopping you from joining us to protect fundamental rights of all Americans? For generations, people have marched, they've fought, and even died for this right to vote. And it's a shame that some would use partisan politics to bring us to this point, that we can't simply agree that the access to the ballot box should be a right afforded to every American. So my question to Republicans is, will you sponsor this legislation, and will you work with us here in the House and in the Senate to pass this legislation this Congress? Since the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was enacted, it has been reauthorized 5 times with large bipartisan majorities, most recently in 2006 and since. But we cannot and we will not allow extremists to tear down our democracy. The Congressional Black Caucus will continue to fight against the voter suppression that plagues our country and impedes access to the ballot box, particularly for communities of color. We will continue to stand strong against any and all efforts to subvert the will of the American people, whether it is the effort to overturn our election on January the 6th or efforts to silence or expel members from the state houses who advocate for a better and safer community. Enough is enough. We're calling for our Republican colleagues to return to this bipartisan tradition and to put people over politics. I'm pleased to be able to be joined with colleagues from the Tri-Caucus and representing the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Representative Veronica Escobar.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my absolute privilege and honor to be here with champions for our democracy, my colleagues. And I am so grateful to my friend, Representative Terri Sewell, for her unyielding leadership, not just on this issue, but on many issues. And especially thank you, Representative Sewell, for continuing to uphold our beloved colleague, John Lewis's legacy. As Representative Horsford mentioned, I'm here representing the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and voter suppression doesn't just impact Black communities. I represent El Paso, Texas, a community that is 85% Latino. And going on right now, this week, in the state of Texas, is a lawsuit, a trial over Senate Bill 1, uh, a voter suppression bill that Texas House and Senate leaders rushed through the state legislative session on the heels of Donald Trump's lies about a stolen 2020 election and about widespread alleged voter fraud that they could never prove. But the facts and the truth, unfortunately, don't matter to many of our Republican colleagues. They are deeply motivated and pushed and controlled by extremism. It is an extremism that is causing them and inspiring them to take control of all levers of power, regardless of the consequences, so they can push through their extremist agenda all over the country. There are consequences in states like mine to not having voter protections. The last election in Texas, 1 out of every 8 mail-in ballots was rejected. I had constituents who weren't even informed that their early voting ballots were rejected. They had to read their names in a newspaper article when local journalists covered the rejection of their early mail-in ballots. The processes put in place by the Texas state legislature are so onerous that my team and other local leaders' phones were flooded with calls of people needing help in order to fill out their mail-in ballots. And we had traditional organizations who wanted to help, but who are barred from helping now. So that when you think about the tens of thousands of people in Texas, in my region, in my community, that whose votes were denied them because of the Texas state legislature, that is voter suppression. And it's intended, again, so that extremist Republicans can have and amass as much power as possible to push their extremist agenda, which is why I'm so proud and privileged to be here with champions for democracy like our next speaker, another great caucus leader who will be we will all be unrelenting until every American has the right to vote in a free and fair election. Help me welcome Judy Chu.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm Congressmember Judy Chu from the 28th Congressional District of California and chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call CAPAC. I want to thank my colleague, Congressmember Terri Sewell, for reintroducing the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act today. And I want to thank my tri-caucus partners in the Congressional Black Caucus and Congressional Hispanic Caucus for standing together to strengthen voting rights for all communities of color. As chair of CAPAC, I know that Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, or AANHPIs, are no stranger to the need for voting rights protections. For 60 long years, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prevented Chinese Americans from even becoming naturalized citizens, just so they could prevent Chinese Americans from voting. This kept us from the decision-making table and left a dark legacy of disenfranchisement, hurting our community's ability to access the American dream. But today, 10 years after the devastating Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision gutting key components of the Voting Rights Act, we're seeing a return to this dark period. For instance, in certain states, there's been criminalization of individuals and groups assisting with voter registration and the withdrawal or denial of multilingual ballots and translators at the polls. In fact, in recent history, in one of my local cities, the election itself was challenged simply because a poll worker talked to a voter in the same language. These shameless voter disenfranchisement tactics especially hurt those in the AANHPI community, over a third of whom are limited English proficient and need that multilingual support to exercise their right to vote. These attacks on our immigrant communities, along with other voter suppression efforts such as aggressive gerrymandering, restrictive voter ID laws, polling location closures, and restrictions on early voting, weaken our democracy by limiting who can make their voices heard. Self interested politicians continue to split up or pack Black, Latino, and AANHPI voters into districts that prevent communities of color from electing the candidates of their choice. Well, we're here to end that. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act will protect and strengthen the right of all Americans to vote so that we can have a say in our democracy. So we are here today to say Congress must do its job, pass this critical bill, and ensure that all Americans, regardless of race, age, or language proficiency, have access to the polls and so that they can exercise their fundamental right to vote. And now I would like to turn it over to the author of the most comprehensive bill to preserve American democracy, Congressmember John Sarbanes.
Thank you very much, Judy, and thank you to Terri Sewell. I've known Terri for almost 4 decades, and I'm pretty sure she was.
Telling our age.
I'm pretty sure that Terri was born fighting for justice, and she's still doing it to this day by being the lead sponsor of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And I know she had to leave, but Representative McClellan is the author of the Virginia version of the Voting Rights Act, which is very important because it shows how this continues to bubble up across the country as an important priority. And we are trying with this bill to embrace that energy here in Washington. I'm privileged to co-chair the Task Force on Strengthening Democracy here, and I can tell you we've been watching surveys over the last few years that show that there's increasing anxiety among the American people, regardless of their political affiliation, about the state of our democracy. They want us to invest in it. They want us to strengthen it. They want to have confidence that when they get up to go vote on the morning of that day, that transaction is something that can happen without obstacles being thrown in their way. Voting rights, and John Lewis certainly understood this, voting rights are human rights. If we don't stand up for voting rights in this country, it sends a message around the world that maybe we're falling away from our responsibility to fight and stand up for human rights. So everything is connected, and certainly Congressman Lewis understood that. Everything he said communicated this idea that we are all stitched together in one fabric. So today we're reintroducing this very, very important piece of legislation. It has advancement in its name for a reason. It is advancing voting rights at a time when we're seeing rollbacks, not just at the state level in ways that call to mind a time that Congressman Clyburn described, but we're seeing a rollback in the Supreme Court. So while those rollbacks are underway, we are here to declare that our efforts to continue the advancement of voting rights will continue. And again, I want to thank Terri Sewell for her absolutely tireless and persistent leadership in this space for so long. And Terri, I'll let you close us out.
I know the votes were just called. We do have time for one question. If anyone has a question. Hi, Congresswoman. My question is, what's your strategy to get Republicans on board?
Well, it's quite simple. Change never happens in the halls of Congress. It bubbles up from grassroots activism. So we need to mobilize and organize in every community. The reality is that voting rights wasn't partisan up until 10 years ago. And so the question really is, why are our Republicans not joining us in making sure that we have this very important protection for our voters? You know, I was asked the question about the Milligan case because that was a bright spot on the Supreme Court. They ruled that Alabama needed to create another majority minority district or something quite close to it. Why? Because of voter dilution. It happens all across the country. It's not just voter suppression, it's also diluting the strength of Black voters and minority voters across this nation. And so House Democrats are here to say no more. We're putting a stake in the ground. We're doing exactly what John told us. Never give up, never give in. We are keeping our eyes on the prize, and that is to make sure that every American has an equal right to vote in this democracy. Thank you.